At dawn on a cold Friday, October 13, 1307, armed men pounded on the doors of Templar residences throughout France. By nightfall, hundreds of knights who had once charged at the forefront of Crusader armies were in chains, accused of heresy, blasphemy, and secret devil worship. How did a small band of poor knights of Christ, sworn to poverty and prayer, become so wealthy and powerful that a king concluded the only solution was to wipe them from history and burn their Grand Master at the stake? And how much of what you've heard about the Knights Templar, Baphomet, the Holy Grail, Friday the 13th, is genuine history? And how much is pure conspiracy theory? In today's video, we'll trace their story from the founding of the Templars in the Holy Land, through their rise as elite Crusader shock troops and pioneers of a medieval banking system, all the way to their dramatic downfall in the flames of Paris. If you enjoy in-depth analyses of medieval history like this one, click the like button so YouTube will recommend this video to more people. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future episodes about Templars, legendary kings, epic battles, and the daily lives of medieval people. Now let's travel back to the beginning, when the Knights Templar were just a handful of poor warriors guarding a very dangerous road. To understand how the Templars ended on the stake, we need to start with something much less dramatic. A small, almost anonymous group of knights trying to keep pilgrims alive on the road to Jerusalem. In the early 1100s, after the First Crusade captured Jerusalem, thousands of European pilgrims started traveling to the Holy Land. Inside the city walls, things were relatively safe. The problem was everything outside. Long roads, mountain passes, and coastal routes filled with bandits and hostile groups who saw unarmed pilgrims as walking treasure chests. Around 1119, a small band of knights led by Jacques de Molay, a minor noble from Champagne in France, offered a radical solution. They would live like monks, fight like professional soldiers, and dedicate their entire lives to protecting pilgrims on those dangerous roads. They called themselves the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, in Latin, Pauperes Commilitones Christi Templici Salomonici. Poor was not just a figure of speech. At the beginning, these men really had very little. They took monastic-style vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, just like monks, and gave up private property. Their famous seal, showing two knights on a single horse, was a kind of visual joke about their poverty, and also a symbol of brotherhood, two men sharing one mount and one mission. Spiritually, the Templars were like warrior monks. They followed a strict rule inspired by Cistercian monasticism and promoted by Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential churchmen of the age. They prayed together, ate together in silence, and were expected to avoid luxury, gambling, and unnecessary conversation. They were forbidden to flee from battle unless heavily outnumbered. Surrender was considered almost a last resort. Militarily, they were something very new in medieval Europe. Before the Crusades, most knights fought for their own lord, for personal honor or profit. The Templars, in theory, fought only for Christ and the protection of pilgrims, not for family or feudal gain. They answered directly to the Pope, not to any local king, and this independence would become crucial later. The Church very quickly realized how useful this holy army could be. At the Council of Troyes in 1129, the Templars were officially recognized as a religious order with a written rule and papal backing. Over the following decades, popes granted them privileges, exemption from many local taxes and tithes, the right to collect donations, and freedom from the authority of local bishops. So, when you hear Knights Templar, think of a hybrid creature the medieval world had never really seen before: monks who ride into battle, professional soldiers who live under vows, an international religious order that reports directly to Rome and ignores local lords when necessary. That combination, spiritual prestige, military effectiveness, and legal independence, made them incredibly attractive to donors and incredibly dangerous to anyone who didn't like powerful, untouchable neighbors. In the next part, this mix of holiness and steel turns a handful of poor knights into the elite shock troops of the Crusades and the owners of castles, fortresses, and treasures across 3 continents. When the Templars started, they really were poor fellow soldiers of Christ. A few decades later, they were feared on the battlefield, rich in land and donations, and present from England to the edges of Syria. That rise is what turned them into legends and eventually into targets. After the First Crusade, the new Latin states in the Holy Land, especially the Kingdom of Jerusalem, had a chronic problem. They never had enough disciplined troops. Local lords could be brave, but they fought for their own families and lands, and they could abandon a battle if their personal interests were threatened. The Templars offered something new. They were a permanent, professional force that did not go home after one campaign and did not owe loyalty to any local prince. As donations poured in from across Europe, land, money, tax exemptions, the order could recruit and equip more brothers. Inside the Templars, there was a clear hierarchy. At the top in the field were the Knight brothers, usually of noble birth, heavily armored cavalry riding expensive war horses with lance and sword. Below them were the sergeants, often of lower status, serving as mounted or foot soldiers, forming the backbone of the fighting force. There were also Turcopoles, locally recruited light cavalry, and archers used especially in the east, and non-combatant brothers who worked as chaplains, administrators, and craftsmen. This structure made them extremely dangerous in battle. They were famous for disciplined cavalry charges, keeping tight formation instead of breaking into a wild rush, and their rule strictly limited when they were allowed to retreat. Sources describe them holding the line so that other Crusader troops could escape or reorganize, often at heavy cost to themselves. Their power did not come only from courage, it came from geography. By the middle of the 12th and 13th centuries, Templars held castles and fortresses at key strategic points, guarding roads, mountain passes and borders, both in the Levant and in Europe. In the eastern Mediterranean, they controlled major strongholds and coastal positions. In France, England, Iberia and beyond, they owned commanderies that acted as local headquarters. Each house could serve as a garrison, a training center, an estate office, and a safe lodging for travelers. At the same time, their spiritual image grew. Preachers and chroniclers portrayed them as ideal Christian warriors, lions in war and lambs in chapel, men who combined harshness against the enemies of Christ with humble devotion in their religious life. Bernard of Clairvaux's text in praise of the new knighthood helped present the Templars as the holy alternative to vain, brutal, secular knights. Because of this, donating to the Templars became both fashionable and spiritually attractive. A noble who could not personally go on crusade could still gain prestige and hope for salvation by gifting land, rents, or money to the order. Small landowners left them fields in their wills, kings granted privileges and exemptions, merchants left them silver for the sake of their souls. With every gift, the order's network of estates and income streams grew. By the 13th century, the Knights Templar had become an elite strike force of the Crusades, a landlord with properties across Latin Christendom, and a symbol of papal favor and holy war. But their direct obedience to the Pope, their independent money flows and their fortified properties inside multiple kingdoms meant they were physically inside royal territories without really being under royal control. For ambitious monarchs, that combination of military power, spiritual prestige, and financial independence began to look less like a blessing and more like a dangerous rival. To explain how the Templars ended up threatening kings without ever raising a sword against them, you have to look at something that seems very modern: their money. By the mid-1100s, their mission had quietly shifted from guarding pilgrims to guarding their valuables. Imagine you are a noble in England or France about to travel to Jerusalem. The roads are long, months of sea and land, and every bandit knows pilgrims are easy prey. Walking around with a bag full of silver is asking to be robbed or killed. The Templars solved this with a system that looks a lot like an early version of traveler's checks. You could go to a Templar house near home, deposit your money or valuables, and receive a letter describing what you had left with them. That document, probably written in a way outsiders could not easily understand, became your key. As you traveled, you could present it at other Templar houses along the route, withdrawing funds as needed, up to the value of your deposit. Suddenly, pilgrims no longer had to carry cash. The risk shifted from the individual to the order. And because the Templars had major bases in places like Paris, London, and in the Eastern Mediterranean, they could move wealth internally from one house to another, balancing their books across continents. This started with pilgrims, But it did not end there. Powerful nobles and even kings realized the same system could work for them. The Templars became trusted guardians of treasuries and documents. King John of England stored his crown jewels at the Temple in London. The Paris Temple acted as a kind of state treasury for the French crown. Church institutions and magnates deposited money and valuables, knowing the order had fortresses, armed men, and a reputation for honesty. From there, another step felt natural: loans. Crusades, wars, and ransoms were brutally expensive. The Templars, sitting on deposits and land income, could lend large sums to kings, nobles, and cities. Louis VII of France borrowed so much for his crusade that he nearly bankrupted the order. Other rulers used Templar networks to shift funds between countries, paying debts in one place with revenues gathered in another. Officially, the medieval church forbade charging interest, but everyone knew money still had a price. The Templars seem to have used legal fictions and rents on pledged property to get around the letter of the law while obeying its spirit on paper. Whether or not every detail was clean, the result was clear. By the 13th century, the Knights Templar had become, in effect, Europe's first international banking network, handling deposits, transfers, safe storage, and massive royal loans. That made them indispensable and terrifying. They were not just warriors anymore. They were the people who knew exactly how much money kings owed and who held the keys to many of Europe's most important treasuries. For a monarch already in debt, that kind of power in someone else's hands could start to look like a noose tightening around his throne. With all this power, the Templars had a problem no rulebook could fix. History turned against them. Their original purpose was to defend the Crusader states in the Holy Land. When those states collapsed, the order kept its wealth, its castles, and its privileges, but lost the war it had been created to fight. In 1187, Saladin's forces crushed a Crusader army at Hattin and recaptured Jerusalem. Over the next century, one coastal stronghold after another was lost, until the fall of Acre in 1291 removed the last major Christian base on the mainland. The Templars retreated to Cyprus and other islands, still dreaming of a great new crusade, but to many in Europe they began to look like heavily armed relics of a failed project. Their houses in Europe did not disappear. If anything, they became more important. Templar commanderies continued to collect rents, donations, and fees, manage estates, and lend money. But now most of that activity was happening far from any battlefield. To critics, the poor Knights of Christ looked suspiciously like rich landowners and bankers who no longer risked their lives in the East. At the same time, the political climate inside Europe was changing. Kings like Philip IV of France were centralizing power and trying to bring every important institution, nobles, towns, even the church, under tighter royal control. The Templars were different. They answered directly to the Pope, not to any king. They enjoyed tax exemptions. Their fortified houses in places like Paris stood almost like states within the state. And then there were the debts. War, administration, and royal display cost a fortune. The French crown in particular borrowed heavily. The Templars, as major financial operators, were deeply entangled in that web of credit. Some modern historians argue that Philip IV's government owed them so much that paying it back would have been almost impossible without drastic measures. Put all of this together, and the picture shifts. By the early 1300s, the Knights Templar were an international order no king could command, owners of rich lands inside multiple kingdoms, controllers of treasuries and records, and creditors to monarchs who were running out of cash. To the public, they still looked like holy warriors. To a ruler like Philip IV, they looked more and more like a rival power, armed, wealthy, legally privileged, and hard to control. The question was no longer whether the Templars served God. It was whether their continued existence served the interests of the King of France. Very soon he would decide that the answer was no. The attack came without warning. On Friday, October 13, 1307, Philip IV of France unleashed what remains one of the most coordinated mass arrests in medieval history. Across the kingdom, royal bailiffs hammered on the doors of Templar houses at dawn. Knights, sergeants, and servants were dragged from their beds, separated from their possessions, and thrown into chains. In Paris alone, over 140 Templars were seized at the Temple fortress. By nightfall, the order had been decapitated in France. The secret orders for this operation had been sent weeks earlier to local officials, with strict instructions to act simultaneously so no one could escape or hide records. Philip's warrants accused the Templars of unspeakable crimes, spitting on the cross, worshipping idols, denying Christ, practicing sodomy, and secret rituals of obscene blasphemy. The shock was total. These were men who had fought for Christendom, who had papal privileges, who had guarded royal treasuries. Now they were branded heretics. Rumors spread instantly. The Templars had been corrupted by Eastern vices or by diabolical pacts made under Solomon's temple. Under torture, racks, burning souls, thumbscrews, many confessed. Some described spitting on crucifixes during initiation rites. Others spoke of kissing superiors on the mouth or base of the spine. The most infamous charge was idolatry, worshipping Baphomet, a demon or bearded head that some later accounts claimed they found in Jerusalem. Historians today are skeptical. These confessions came from extreme physical agony, and many Templars later recanted. The charges sound like a greatest hits list of medieval heresy accusations, designed to shock and justify seizure of property. Still, the damage was done. Philip paraded repentant Templars through Paris in chains, letting the crowd hurl abuse. The Pope Clement V was caught off guard. Weakened by illness and politically dependent on Philip after the Avignon papacy move, he initially tried to take control of the trials, but Philip had already seized Templar assets and filled French royal coffers. Over the next few years, investigations spread beyond France. In England, arrests were slower and more restrained. In Aragon and Portugal, many Templars were acquitted or absorbed into other orders. But in France, the machinery of persecution ground on. Trials dragged through 1308 to 1311, with torture, recantations, and political pressure. Finally, at the Council of Vienne in 1311 to 1312, Clement suppressed the order not for proven heresy, but because it was too divisive for Christendom. Templar property went, in theory, to the Knights Hospitaller, though kings kept most of the best estates. For Philip, mission accomplished. He had eliminated his creditors and gained a massive windfall, but the Templars would have one last defiant word. After years of trials, torture, and political theatre, the end came quickly. In 1312, at the Council of Vienne, Pope Clement V officially suppressed the Knights Templar. Not because the charges of heresy were conclusively proven, but because their continued existence was dividing Christendom and harming the Crusade effort. Templar properties were supposed to pass to the Knights Hospitaller, their great rivals. In practice, kings like Philip IV kept the best estates, castles, and treasuries. In France, the Paris Temple, once the order's greatest stronghold, became royal property. Most Templars were quietly absorbed into other orders, imprisoned for life, or released after penance. But the leadership faced a harsher fate. In March 1314, on a specially built platform in front of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, and several high officials were sentenced to burn. According to legend, and there are contemporary accounts, as the flames rose, de Molay recanted his confessions, proclaimed the order's innocence, and summoned Pope Clement and King Philip to meet him before God within the year. Whether he really said those words or not, both men were dead within months. Clement in April, Philip in November. The story of the Templar curse was born. With de Molay's death, the Knights Templar ceased to exist as an institution. Nearly 2 centuries of history, from dusty roads outside Jerusalem to financial centers across Europe, ended in smoke over the Seine. But the Templars did not disappear from memory. Far from it. Their dramatic fall, combined with their earlier glory, planted seeds for centuries of rumor, legend, and conspiracy. Next, we look at what survived the flames, and what never existed, except in the imagination. The Templars' violent end guaranteed they would never fade away. Their story, poor knights turned bankers turned heretics burned at the stake, was too perfect for legends. Most Templar myths emerged in the decades and centuries after 1314. Did they find the Holy Grail or Ark of the Covenant under Solomon's Temple? Almost certainly not. The Order's early base was near the Al-Aqsa Mosque, built over the Temple Mount ruins, but there's no contemporary evidence they dug for relics. Those tales come from later romances and novels. Baphomet, the infamous idol from the trials. Confessions described a bearded head or demon, but scholars now think it was a garbled reference to Mahomet, Muhammad, or a simple misunderstanding of a ritual object. No Baphomet statue was ever found. Friday the 13th as unlucky. That superstition only gained traction centuries later, retroactively linked to the arrests. Templar treasure. Philip seized mountains of silver and gold from their Paris vaults, but rumors persist of a lost fleet escaping with secret riches to Scotland or Oak Island. No hard proof. Freemasonry? The first Masonic Templar rituals appear in the 1700s, long after the Order's death. Modern Freemasons claim spiritual descent, but there's no direct link. What did survive? Institutions. In Portugal, Templars rebranded as the Order of Christ under royal protection, funding Portugal's maritime expansion with their wealth and networks. Their Red Cross flew on Vasco da Gama's sails. In places like Aragon, assets went to local orders. The Hospitallers inherited some houses, but kings grabbed the rest. The real Templar legacy was practical, a model of international organization, disciplined military brotherhood, and financial innovation that shaped banking, orders, and even modern corporations. From dusty pilgrim roads to the stake, the Knights Templar lived just under 2 centuries. But their story, equal parts fact and fire, still burns in the imagination today. Thank you for watching the video. I hope to see you here again.